This is Just Something About Her, a podcast from the Recount and iHeartRadio. This week's guest, Errin Haines. So you formed the newsroom last summer.
Yeah.
This is your first anniversary. Tell us about that.
After 2016, I knew that there were too many newsrooms that did not get right what happened with that election. Right. And I knew that I didn't want to wake up after the election in 2020. I wanted to be able to wake up and say that we did get it right, that we did tell the story that needed to be told about this election and about who and where we were as a country in that moment, right? And I knew going into 2020 that race and gender were not just a story of the 2020 election, like they were the story. Mm-hmm. And if people were not going to say that as, collectively, not just me as the race writer at the AP, but the whole politics team needed to be writing stories playing to those themes, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing about coming to the 19th, it's not that I wasn't going to, I was writing the stories that I probably was going to write for this election, right? But I was writing them as the main dish, not the side dish, if that makes sense. Right. Yes. Right. They were the story. They were not, oh, and by the way, let's have this sidebar that talks about a race angle or a gender angle. It's like, no, the whole damn thing is about this. And if people don't understand that, then no.
And so the 19th, so it's named for the 19th Amendment, in which some women, white women, won the right to vote. Right. But you were the co-founder who came up with the idea of putting an asterisk behind the T.
Thank you for asking me about this, Jim, because I do love talking about the asterisk. When we were conceiving this newsroom and kind of conceiving the name of it and the mission and the vision for it, the 19th Amendment was something that was very very powerful symbol for a lot of us. But at the same time, as a Black woman who knows the history of this amendment, I certainly understood that naming this newsroom that, especially with what we wanted to do in terms of changing the conversation, not just around gender, but also around race and politics, was that we had to talk about.
And you formed it last year, which was in the you formed it in the middle of the...
heading into the centennial of suffrage, but also coinciding with this national reckoning around race, right? Yeah. And really around institutions and systemic inequality, right? So all of that just made the asterisk that much more powerful to me. And that asterisk is in recognition of the omission of the Black women who frankly were thrown under the bus by the white women who, were fighting for the right to vote. But there were Black suffragists that stood shoulder to shoulder with them who were sacrificed. You've still got Black women on the front lines, fighting for their very fragile access to the franchise, even as we speak, right? But you had, many white women, once they got their access to the franchise, they abandoned that fight. They no longer saw the need to continue to be suffragists because they got what they wanted. And so they don't necessarily see this as their fight anymore. And I think you have women of color who are back on the front lines, or some of whom never left the front lines, who are saying, hello, we need you in a way that you weren't there for us 100 years ago. Please show up for us now, because this is something that, affects, that if it affects any women, it should affect all women, and everybody should care about this issue. One of the hardest adjustments for me coming to the 19th, as somebody who, as a Black woman, I wrote about race, thought about race as a person, as a journalist for pretty much my whole life, my whole career. It wasn't until I came here that I really had the freedom, honestly, to think about what it means to be a woman in this country. Right. And how being a woman, how that is political, the ways in which that shows up in our politics and our decisions around politics. And what I realized is, this is why people associate feminism with white women, because if you don't have to think about your race as something that holds you back, you think about the other thing that you
think about the other thing that holds you back,
which is your gender. And I really didn't realize that. But even now, thinking about being a woman, that intersection of race and gender is still very much present for me, and that is the lens through which I see so much of the work that I do.
You run into this notion of, well, if all of you women are going to go and create your own newsroom where you're only hiring women and you're talking about women's issues, you are no longer objective journalists. How do you, when people say oh, but you're only focusing on women, you're only hiring women, and but how do you respond to those critics?
First of all, objectivity is a myth. in journalism, and it is easy to be objective when the default setting is white and male. Like that, that is not real. That is who decided, that there was going to be objectivity in journalism, and what that usually means is that we are, we are here to tell the truth, and if the truth makes people uncomfortable, I mean, that is a core tenet of journalism, is to afflict the comfortable, right? We are here to right wrongs. We are here to speak truth to power. We are here as journalists to leave behind the most honest and accurate record of what happened. And if we are both sidesing everything, we are not necessarily doing that. And in fact, we may be leaving a less honest and accurate record behind when we attempt to do that just for the sake of what? Of giving people equal time. Like that's not the point of journalism.
And did you always want to be a journalist?
No, I mean, it wasn't until I got to college and I had to pick a major, and it was like,
where'd you go to college?
Nosy. I went to Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. Okay. And I'm nosy. So that was
you
one
are definitely
thing.
Nosy.
Definitely. Mom, I would say curious, but my mom would, if you ask her, she's going to tell you I'm nosy. And, but I like learning about different things and meeting new people all the time. And so journalism seemed like something that I could do that didn't feel like work. So, so I tried it. There was a small black paper in Atlanta that needed reporters, and I walked in the door one day and said, "Hey, I could use some exposure here." And they were like, "Can you start today?" And I was like, "Great." And that was really, it was the Atlanta Daily World was the name of the paper, and it was a formative. Exist? It does still exist. Okay. But it was formative for me because it's one of the oldest papers in the black press in this country. And the stories that we told were about the black community in its totality, right? So not just, stories about black folks in crisis or trauma, but, black people leading, black people who had businesses, families, writing about people who look like me, and also just understanding that those people were worth writing about, that they belonged on the front page of that newspaper, and that there were black people in positions of authority that we needed to hold accountable. And so like that experience I carried with me throughout my career. I went on to work at the Orlando Sentinel, at the Los Angeles Times, at the Washington Post. I did a couple of tours at the AP in my hometown, and then also in Philly, where I now live, which I am obsessed with.
And then one day, as I understand it, you got a call from the attorney, Benjamin Crump, who told you the name of a woman that's come to be very important in our society. Tell us about that whole experience.
When I started my journalism career, and I knew that I wanted to write about race, I thought that at that time, this is me in my early 20s, I'm thinking I'm going to be writing about the legacy of the civil rights movement, the gains that those folks had kind of fought for, like the fruits of their labor, and also the kind of the last vestiges of racism.
Because you thought that was the path that we were on. You thought
that
this
was
is
where
mostly
we were
resolved.
As a society. Yes. And so I thought I was going to be writing about that. Most of the latter part of my career, I have been writing about the resurgence and the retrenchment of racism, and about the losses of that progress, which is something that has been very disheartening and very discouraging in a lot of ways as a black person, as an American, but a very fascinating time for me as a journalist. Sure. And, a big part of that has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was kind of how I came to meet Attorney Crump, who I've worked with since the Trayvon Martin case in 2012. Benjamin Crump is, he is the attorney that shows up when so many of these tragedies happen. Exactly. Yeah. And so we get to last spring, there's a pandemic raging. And, so he is not the person that I expect to get a call from. And yet here he is calling me and telling me the story of this young woman, 26-year-old black woman, paramedic, so, first responder in the pandemic, who is gunned down in her apartment in the middle of the night. And her name was Breonna Taylor. George Floyd hadn't yet happened, but Ahmaud Arbery, who had happened in my home state of Georgia, he had just been killed, and people were there were hashtags for him, and people were very upset about what had happened to him in this pandemic, and yet there was hardly any national coverage about what had happened to this young woman. And this immediately resonated with me. I mean, at the 19th, I didn't think I was going to be writing about Black Lives Matter very much anymore, because most of the people who are killed are Black men, unfortunately. But here you have this Black woman whose case was no less egregious, and yet, you know, why was she getting less attention? Well, I mean, gender is part of that, and you have to be honest about that. And so when he came to me, it was a no-brainer to me that this was a story for the 19th, that we were going to put her story on the national radar, hopefully get her story trending, and hopefully let the world know what had happened to her, because it was horrific. It was more than a tragedy. It seemed unjust, and it seemed like something that people needed to know about. I do think it resonated more because we were saying that it mattered, and that we were this new newsroom that was really setting priorities and putting a stake in the ground and saying, no, like this is a thing that we care about, and this is a thing that we think that you should care about too.
Thanks for watching. You can watch the full episode of Just Something About Her on the Recount, streaming daily, or listen to it wherever you get your podcasts.